everyone. Welcome to yet another Midwestern Marx stream on Twitch and YouTube. Got some very special guests today from the Troika Collective. Um, I guess I'll let you comrades introduce yourselves as people filter in here and talk a little bit about what you're about and what the Troika Collective is about before we start our conversation here.
Hey, yeah. Hey, y'all. My name is Comrade Libre. Eki Sankara, part of Troika Collective. We were founded in 2020 during the uprisings, and we are a anti-imperialist media collective, as well as organizers and cultural workers throughout Turtle Island that combat imperialist lies by going to places and getting working class perspectives on the movements that are happening against imperialism. We are socialists organizing against imperialism within the belly of the beast, but also as firm internationalists supporting the revolutionary movements that are happening against imperialism in all the countries of the global south, as well as fighting for revolution here on Turtle Island against imperialism, because revolution is necessary wherever there are working class people. Poet and cultural worker based here in Miccosukee, Tequesta, Seminole Land, also known as Miami. Yes, we exist. We are here in Miami as communists. But gonna hand it over to the homie Yamir.
Peace, y'all. So my name is Yamir Chabur. I'm from Queens, New York, known as Occupy Lenape territory. I am of Colombian descent. I'm part of the Troika Collective. I'm happy to be part of this collective here that we create media content in order to be in solidarity with the revolutionary processes that's happening throughout Latin America and the third world. As you see, we have our name Troika from that term under the Trump administration, where his administration called, they had this term called the Troika of Tyranny that they called Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela places that they had. There's a shirt right there. It's a dope shirt. Places that they needed to overthrow because they were a threat to the Western Hemisphere, but we saw it as that they're the troika of resistance, that each of these countries have had revolutions that for one way or another has shifted the continent and also inspired other revolutions within the continent. Within the continent, whether it's the Cuban Revolution, the Sandinista Popular Revolution, or the Bolivarian Revolution, we understand that we get our name from that inspiration right there. As we saw just recently with this joke of the Summit of the Americas, how Biden continued that same policy of excluding the Troika. So we've seen that Biden continued the Trump policy in Latin America, but we see that there's a pushback now. That there's many different Latin American countries that are not with the shits anymore. I don't know if I can curse here.
Go for it.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that they're not with the shits of being treated as their backyard. And we're seeing now a shift, whether we're seeing like countries like Mexico taking a stance against this policy, like AMLO, or countries like Honduras with Xiomara Castro, or in Bolivia with their plural national state and their president Lucho Arce, and now what we're seeing right now in Colombia with this historical win, this victory, that I'm just so happy for my people right now. I'm in a jubilous, celebratory mood still. It's been 2 days, but it's an unbelievable like event, but we can get more into it as the program goes on. But I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me on.
Of course, brothers. We're happy to have you. I like how you mentioned the Summit of Exclusion, which I think is a good historical event to show the fact that we're entering into a new political moment in our hemisphere, where South America, Latin America in general, La Patria Grande, is becoming more united and militant against imperialism. And in this context, I think that it is important to always emphasize, especially as folks living within the belly of the beast, that the interest of the American working class is always tied to the interest of the international working class and of exploited and oppressed people abroad. So, discussing the breakdown of how to completely demolish the imperialist narratives on these countries in the global South is absolutely essential for our struggle here. We wanted to focus our conversation today on Colombia because, as you mentioned, Yamir, we had a pretty historic victory yesterday by Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez, the first leftist government in Colombian history. Colombia does have a long history of socialist and militant struggle, right? It hasn't won, but they do have a rich history of struggle. But this is the first official time that there's been somewhat of a leftist come to power. Can you tell us a bit about the history of the Colombian struggles for socialism and where does Gustavo Petro and this Pacto Histórico movement sort of place itself with regards to that history?
Oh, yeah. I love that question. I love that question because I could start from any different angle, from any different point of time, whether it's the present or the past. I do feel that this right here is marking a new chapter for the Colombian people. This has shown a shift in that society. Given the fact that we've never had a progressive government, we've had very conservative governments, and I think I'm gonna start with what our queen, our new vice president Francia Marquez said during the victory speech, that for over 214 years we have been oppressed, people have been marginalized, but now we have achieved a popular government that is for the people, para el pueblo. And I say that because for over 2 centuries, ever since like the betrayal of Simon Bolivar, the great liberator of South America, of somebody who had a vision for a unified Latin America with the project of El Gran Colombia, which was Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Panama, at the time, but he wanted to expand that, to the Caribbean, even to Florida. But anyways, the this oligarchy that has ruled Colombia for these 2 centuries since the betrayal of Bolivar has done nothing but been a bunch of vendepatrias, selling the territory to multinational corporations, allowing U.S. imperialism to come in and do what they want to do, whether that's to build military bases. Colombia has over 9 military bases, allow the U.S. to come in with paramilitary forces, as well as to suppress any type of change. I mean, Colombia is also known as a country where you have social leaders getting killed, but also presidential leaders getting killed as well. And one person that comes to mind is Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, the liberal popular candidate during 1948, who was assassinated. But he was like he was seen as like this person that was supposed to win the presidential elections back in 1948. And like with having the understanding of like what went down before he was becoming before him running for the presidency, of how the U.S. Due to the United Fruit Company had a massacre, known as the Banana Massacres, where they killed a bunch of workers that were on strike, and the Colombian government, under the orders of the United Fruit Company, sent the military to go kill the workers, which awoke in Gaitan. And is like, this is important because Gaitan understood U.S. imperialism and understood the importance of agrarian reform. And like 2 days before he got assassinated, of April 9th of 1948, he actually met with a young Fidel Castro, when Fidel was a university student and was going to Colombia for like an anti-imperialist, like Latin American integration forum, where he was speaking on behalf for Cuba liberation, for Puerto Rico's liberation, and against the dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. So what I'm trying to go with that is, when Gaitan gets assassinated, there's this big turmoil known as the Bogotazo, where it leads Colombia into this civil war between liberals and conservatives that would pass for 10 years. and they would make a peace agreement amongst each other. These were two oligarchical factions that were in disagreements. But in the middle of that, you had farmers that had never had any representation, because one of the biggest fight for Colombia is the land. Like, Colombia is like the second country that's rich in biodiversity. Like, we're like the only country in South America that we're between the two oceans. We have a Amazon region, we have an Andean region, where we're by the Caribbean. Like, you could grow anything in Colombia, but unfortunately, like, due to that oligarchy, they don't care invest in Colombia's rich biodiversity. So what we see is like how Colombia is like is I've had young comrades from the communes, las comunas, which is the legal faction of the FARC, tell me that Colombia is worse than a neoliberalist or capitalist society. It's a semi-feudal society where you have from 4 to 6 families that own most of the land. So this has always been a fight for the land ever since, the origins of the FARC, and like the origins of the FARC comes out of the farmer struggle. And this shows that why the essence of the problem in Colombia. But to go forward with Gustavo Petro, with the win between Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez, it shows a pushback from that. A pushback from like these politics of the right, and that people in Colombia are ready. They want a shift in the way politics are being done. They want a change, a shift away from this political movement that has been in power for 20 years, Uribismo. That is its main protagonist is the ex-president of the 2000s, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, who was known for having ties to the paramilitaries and also having historical ties with the Medellin cartel of one of the famous drug dealer that he always gets Netflix series, and like you hear him on like rap lyrics of Pablo Escobar. We seen that people had a break from that type of political ideology that has turned Colombia nothing more into a narco state. So I mean, yeah, I mean, we had like our national strike last year, like the same national strike that the neighboring country Ecuador is having right now, against not just this government, but just the neoliberalist policies they try to enforce amongst the people. And that type of energy, and we'll talk about it more during the program, is what brought this win, this historic win of having our first leftist president, Gustavo Petro, who's also an ex-guerrilla. Like, he was part of the M19 movement, and also having our first Afro-Colombian woman, environmentalist leader, Francia Marquez, as the vice president.
That was a great history there. Super informative for all of us, probably. I want to pull this up too, because this is a graphic I use a lot. This just details the U.S. military presence in Colombia. I saw some people in the chat comparing it to South Korea or Israel, or I guess Honduras until recently would have been a good comparison as well. As you said there's just a giant military presence. And something you said that I thought was really interesting was, some of your friends or comrades in Colombia had almost compared it to a semi-feudal state, or said they don't even have, capitalism, which I had never thought about it that way. I just thought of it as an incredibly unequal neoliberal country. So that's really, really interesting to hear that some of the comrades in Colombia are making that analysis.
Yeah. Connected to that, you mentioned these semi-feudal conditions that many Colombians are in. What connection does that have to the drug trade and cocaine, which of course we know that the U.S. American capital and the American state and the institutions in the American state that supposedly fight against drug consumption and distribution, like the DEA, they have a central role in the distribution and production of those drugs that come out of Colombia. But what connection does the drug trade and I guess drug capital, what connection does it have to those feudal conditions, because it seems like it produces a dual surplus, both an economic surplus and the fact that it makes billions and billions of dollars, but also a political surplus because it allows, as drugs naturally do, the sort of degeneration of communities that make it sometimes difficult for those communities to fight back against the conditions which oppress them. So how does those semi-feudal conditions and the condition of Colombia in general, and some of the mass poverty that you find in Colombia, how does that relate to the somewhat unique role of drugs that the U.S. empire has inputted in Colombia in collaboration with those traditional forces of capital, which have held their power, as you mentioned, for the last 200 years, because there's never really been a major land reform in Colombia. So, what role does that have in the situation we see today?
Well, I would start with saying that this oligarchy that we have in Colombia has always been subservient to the United States. Like I'll give a prime example. I mean, Panama was once part of Colombia, but because the U.S. wanted the Panama Canal, uh, the U.S. was easily able to buy off the Colombian oligarchy in order to attain that land, in order to attain the control of the Panama Canal. And the U.S. gave them a island that they occupied from Nicaragua called San Andres, which this is why Nicaragua and Colombia has tensions over like the maritime borders. Um, but anyhow, I mean, to like get to your question about like how the drug trade is like interconnected to the feudal society, it just kind of makes me think of like this time period of, and it's funny how I mentioned Nicaragua during the Contra Wars, when you had Ronald Reagan funding this death squad. That he called them freedom fighters. He compared them to like Thomas Jefferson, but they weren't doing anything but doing terrorist attacks and blowing up like hospitals and like trying to roll back the Sandinista revolution because they overthrew a U.S. backed dictator, Anastasio Somoza. There was a point where the U.S. Congress didn't want to fund the Contras anymore, and in order for Reagan to fund these Contras, he had to use drug money from the cartel of Medellin, of Pablo Escobar's cartel, and traffic those drugs from Panama using Manuel Noriega to California, where they had like a low-ranking drug dealer by the name of Ricky Ross, that converted the cocaine into crack and distributed all around the Black and Latino neighborhoods in order to deneutralize the Black Power movement and the young lords and the brown berets at the time, and use all that money to fund the Contras in order to like destabilize the Sandinistas, which they were successful at doing when they got them out of power electorally wise. I mean, through these aggressive intervention policies. But I'm saying this is a chess piece of Colombia in the drug trade, of how even the way that how the United States utilizes the drug trade in order to have an excuse to have a military presence in Colombia, and also for Colombia to be this key strategical place to attack other parts of the region. Like I could get into Venezuela, or I could get into like Haiti, for example, of how you had the ex-president Jovenel Moise that was killed by Colombian mercenaries that were probably trained in the schools of the Americas in the United States. But another thing to also keep in mind as well is that you have areas in Colombia, rural areas, where farmers don't have nothing else but to like grow the coca leaf, that's made to make cocaine, because they don't have an economy viable for them in order to sell other type of products like potatoes, like rice, like other things that they would love to sell, but due to their limitations in the Colombian market, all they could sell is the coca leaf. And also like the coca leaf is a natural plant, is a healing plant that comes from the indigenous people. I mean, I think a primary example like Evo Morales in Bolivia, before Evo Morales, took power in Bolivia, Bolivia was a narco state. I mean, Bolivia had these narco dictators like Hugo Banzer in the 1980s that that had Bolivia. I mean, yeah, they had Bolivia exporting cocaine, and the DEA was there. When Evo Morales took power, what did he do? He kicked out the DEA and turned coca into a legalized plant, you know, and all the healthy traits of that leaf, which benefited Bolivian society. I mean, you don't hear Bolivia being a narco state anymore. Same thing goes for Colombia. I mean, you've had the DEA there for like over 20 or 30 years, and Colombia is the main exporter of cocaine in the world. So just, you know, to add up all the dots, and I mean, you also have the politicians that are involved in the drug trade, like Alvaro Uribe. I mean, Alvaro Uribe has direct ties to the Medellin cartel. Like, to me, the Medellin cartel never disappeared. They turned into his political party, El Centro Democrático. You had like actually one of Pablo Escobar's hitmen that led during the 2016 vote of referendum to respect the peace accords, the Havana peace accords that Cuba led for the peace accords in between the FARC and the Colombian government. Pablo Escobar's main hitman, Popeye, I think, yeah, Popeye, led the no campaign against that. So you know, I don't know if that answers your question right there.
Yeah, and one of the more cynical things is that in the speech that Uribe gave yesterday, it's just so ridiculous. It's so absolutely ridiculous. He talks about Petro as the mastermind behind Chavez, and he's about to bring forth a neo-communism, and it's insane. But one of the most cynical things is that he's talking as if what Pedro is going to do to the drug trade is continue it, and as if his sort of administration and his line, which has dominated the last like 2 decades in Colombia, as if they're the ones that have been fighting against the drug trade, when he's one of the main, as you mentioned, one of the main culprits, and sort of inherited this tradition of the Medellin cartel. So what do you say about that, and how does that sort of cynicism, how does it reflect itself in the minds of everyday working and poor Colombians?
Well, I think during Alvaro Uribe's time, he was able to convince the population in Colombia that he was defending the interests of the middle class. Like, people in Colombia believed that there was a middle class that people could, you know, work the ladder up to. And Uribe, you know, was a person that convinced people that he was defending their interests. But he was also somebody who started a lot of neoliberalist policies, like privatizing healthcare, and privatizing education. So like he really created like this mindset during the 2000s, and also making people believe that he was winning the war against the guerrillas. There's this famous scandal called the false positive scandal, where he told the military to go kill farmers and students in the rural areas and dress them up as guerrillas to show that, you know, he was defeating the FARC. But that wasn't the case. And as well as the other thing too is that he turned Colombia the tensions between Colombia and Venezuela started with Uribe. I mean, Uribe was the arch nemesis of Hugo Chavez. He was the arch nemesis of the Bolivarian Revolution. Very good friends with the Bush administration. Had very close ties. I mean, Bush brought him over and gave him like a presidential honor Medal of Freedom, and basically like I think before he was held up very highly by a lot of folks, but I think it all went down with his puppet Ivan Duque. I mean, the president before him, Juan Manuel Santos, was also put into power by Uribe, but he kind of gave Uribe he turned his back on Uribe, not on some like power to the people type of stuff, but like more like capitalist stuff, because Santos comes from the oligarchy. He's a child of the oligarchy. So he wanted to defend more of U.S. multinational corporation interests in Colombia. That's the whole reason why there was a peace accord in 2016 between the FARC and the Colombian government, but which was being coordinated by Cuba and Venezuela. You know, and when Uribe's successor, well, the other successor, Duque, who's in power right now, but he's on his door. He's on the way out right now. And we call him Porky also. So Porky is a character because you could really tell that he has no like mind. He has no intelligence. Like he follows Uribe's orders, and I think due to his administration and how he dealt with Colombia as far as like trying to roll back stuff like the peace accords, not really like also trying to enforce more neoliberalist policies because there was already massive protests before last year with el paro nacional. There was one also in 2019 when there was massive protests happening throughout the continent in Ecuador and Chile against neoliberalism. And also, going towards last year, like during the pandemic, about how people saw the way he dealt with the whole situation in the country, how he tried to privatize during a time where people were unable to work, people had no access to healthcare. There was a lot of young people that wanted to migrate out, and the last thing this guy does is tries to raise the prices of food, and people went out and protest, this motherfucker. And they I think what augmented this national strike was a response by Duque's administration of unleashing the military. He unleashed the military. He militarized certain cities like Cali, a city in the West Pacific region of Colombia. And people saw that you say you don't have money for social programs, but you have money for the military, and of course they have a lot of money for the military. I mean, Colombia is the third recipient of U.S. military funding after Israel and Egypt. I mean, Hugo Chavez from Venezuela called Colombia the Israel of Latin America. So there was massive lives lost during these national strikes. I mean, you had people that were kidnapped, you had people that were killed, you had people that are in prison still. People had to flee out of the country. So of course, moving towards this year, a lot of that energy came into the elections, and also just people being fed up with Uribe and Uribismo. So that answers your question.
Oh yeah, splendidly. Eddie, do you have a question? Because I had one connected to it, but I've asked the last couple, so I wanted to.
No, go for it. You've asked the same stuff I've wanted to ask for the most part, so.
I'm sure you had this one in the list, but you just mentioned the sort of killings that are done on the part of the death squads, which again are largely funded by the U.S. There's a lot of people that have been worried even before the election of Petro, even before the victory, that something could happen to the Petro administration. And there was, I believe, a leading general that threatened Petro on Twitter. There's little flies flying around. There's a leading general that threatened Petro on Twitter. So how much of a concern are those death squads? And what about the military? Because the military, from what it seems like, at least outside, seems to be in line with Uribismo.
Well, I don't know. Dude, does Comrade Lieber want to take this? Because I feel like I've been talking a lot.
I got you, homie. And you can just fill in with your mass amount of knowledge of your beautiful country. So I think what we have to understand, like I said, I was in Colombia as an international observer para la primera vuelta, for the first round of elections. And what happened when we went to go is they gave us historical context on the history of Colombia in relation to elections, what you'll find is that Colombia is one of the most dangerous places to exercise your right to vote. That being said, leading up to these elections, over 44 massacres have happened. Massacres, right, of individuals in Colombia. And what is very interesting is if you look at a map, if folks are looking for really good like infographics and maps on Colombia, Indepas is a great resource that covers it. And what you'll see is the same parts of Colombia. In Spanish, it's called las regiones periferias, the periphery, the marginalized, the surrounding communities of Colombia, the places that voted en masse for Petro y Francia Marquez are also the places where all these genocides are happening, are also the places where literally going out to exercise your right to vote is a matter of life and death. And I think that is not an understatement. Literally last week, a Afro-Colombian activist, 60, I believe she was 60, between 60 and 63 years old, she was killed, leaving her son's house. Last week, 22 individuals, 12 of which came from the same region that that Rodolfo's from, were arrested. So there are 22 individuals from La Primera Línea that were arrested leading up to the elections. And what we'll find is that historically speaking, the same communities that both Francia Marquez and Petro represent are the same communities that historically have been the most attacked, right? These are the regions that have the highest amount of paramilitary forces. These are also happen to be the regions that produce coca, right? So there's a direct correlation with what happens in Colombia and the influence of the U.S. Why does the U.S. military have over 7 military bases in Colombia? Why in the communities that happen to produce coca? Why is that where the most violence is happening? And how does that connect to our communities in Turtle Island that are also attacked for using the drugs that were planted in our communities? And so there's a direct correlation between what happens in Colombia and what happened in Turtle Island. And I think that when I was able to go to Bogota to observe elections, I was able to make some concrete connections between the role of the U.S. military in Colombia and the fight against the so-called war on drugs in the U.S. And why do we still have a so-called war on drugs? We're not attacking the root cause because it's the governments that are working together to exploit their communities and put them either in jail or kill them. Same things are happening in both of these countries. And so, and also to give individuals context, there have been multiple death threats against Francia Marquez and Petro, which is why you may not see it on mainstream US media, but it was trending in Colombia when Petro and Francia went to go out and speak. They literally had to have individuals with bulletproof shields because they literally were going into areas that that historically speaking have had activists and presidential candidates killed in the process of running to the election. So even the fact that Petro and Francia are still alive is itself a historical moment, right? And I think it's important because the elections in Colombia, unlike the elections in places like the U.S., this is a shift towards the left, a historical shift towards the left, but also this is the first time that a leftist candidate has not been killed in the process of running for elections. And that and we have to be vigilant because right, August 7th is when they get into power. But our role as internationalists, right, in praxis, right? We talk about being internationalist in theory. Being internationalist in praxis is to uphold the fact that over 11 million Colombians went out to exercise their right to vote, and a majority of these individuals went out knowing that there were not any government notices saying that they were protected. So the other thing to note is that in Colombia, that there has been no government that has been able to guarantee the safety of individuals going out to exercise their right to vote. Never has there been a government that has been able to address that. Francia Marquez and Petro, that both come from regions that run high risks if they vote, have made that part of their platform. To move towards a Colombia that fights for peace and that fights for love, that is able to address the paramilitary individuals in these regions. And as we were talking about a little bit earlier, Yamir and I, right, the ELN, which is a paramilitary force, has just released a statement saying they are willing to meet with Petro to talk about demilitarizing the paramilitary forces and talk about peace, because there also has not been any government up to now that has agreed to uphold the peace accords that were signed in 2016. And so Petro and Francia Marquez represent a lot of the wishes and hopes of, as Francia Marquez would say, the people that did not have a voice up to now, right? And so this election was a matter of life and death for a lot of individuals, mostly the ones that did go out to vote for Francia Marquez and Gustavo Petro.
That's incredible. I mean, the fact that they could have died in the process of campaigning. It's like Carlos and I both worked for the Burning campaign, before we continued in our political development a little bit. But our main critique of the campaign was that they were sending us to like too high income of neighborhoods. We wanted to go to some of the poorer neighborhoods. Like, it reminds me of something Carlos and I were talking about the other day. Like, Western leftists almost just have no idea or no concept of what it would be like to go into a place, to try and organize, where you might die, where you might be killed by paramilitary forces, or the U.S.-backed fascist groups that they put on the ground in pretty much anywhere where the empire is targeting. And it's crazy. And you talk about, being internationalist in praxis. And yeah, I think it's super important to show solidarity with these movements, and then also to study them, just so, as Western leftists who are in a completely different context, not to say the U.S. couldn't devolve into fighting and violence at some point, but for now, a completely different context than the places that the U.S. empire has been destabilizing for years. I don't know. I think it's really important and useful for us to study that. And as you said, give solidarity and practice in any way that we can.
Yeah. Right before Ymir gets back on, because I think we're going to make similar points, so it's going to tie into it. Even the understanding the context of how Pacto Histórico was formed, right? Pacto Histórico is a left unity, right? It is a left unity that is made up of the Partido Comunista de Colombia, Unión Patriótica, the Liberal Party, right? So ideologically, they don't necessarily agree, but what they do agree on is that Colombia needs to be in a position of power in favor of the working class. And so they united to create the Pacto Histórico, and they won. And that being said, a lot of the individuals that are carrying on this work are individuals that have lost individuals. For example, I had the opportunity to interview Maria Jose Pizarro, the daughter of Carlos Pizarro, who was a presidential candidate from the left that was massacred. He was one of 4 presidents in a short time span that were massacred. And so Colombia comes from a history where the people have not been able to heal, and Urubismo was pushing the knife deeper into the heart of the Colombian people and killing it. And so what this represents is also an opportunity not only for Colombians to move to the left, but also to actually vote in favor of tangible change away from a narco dictatorship, away from governments that have been historically exploiting the Colombian people. Yamir?
Yeah, yes, brother. I just wanted to add on. So that general Carlos you were talking about, his name is Edgardo Zapatero, and he actually violated when he made that threat to Petro on Twitter. He actually violated electoral policies that military personnel are not supposed to be getting involved. But that just shows one of the biggest hurdles that Petro and Francia and their administration are going to have. I mean, the big hurdle itself of them getting elected and coming into state power, they've achieved that. I mean, it wasn't easy because of the amount of death threats that Petro and Francia received, the amount of ineptitude from the part of the Duque administration that did not want to defend them, um, that they had to show up to rallies with like people having big shields. I don't know. You could check this out on like videos and stuff of them having speeches. Like there was one speech that Francia Marquez gave. I think it was like the night. It was like the night before the first round of the elections that she had like a laser beam pointed at her, and the two guards right there like with the big shields had to like shield that beam, but she still kept speaking. She's like to me that was very powerful. um that made me think about a lot about Jorge Lazar Gaitan. um and yeah, that just showed how this was life and death, like Libre said. People are fed up in Colombia, people are sick and tired. They want to change, and people are now willing to organize and fight for that change. But it's not to say that there's going to be obstacles. I mean, Petro and Francia still, their life is at risk. I mean, they still are at risk of getting killed and assassinated. And now more than ever, like having a military apparatus, the general, that we all know now is Uribista, and like military soldiers there trained by the schools of the Americas. So they have a lot to that's on their plate. But I think the important part is how they're achieving national unity. And this is one thing I think about what the peace accords is, that what the peace accords does more for Petro's movement is strengthen it more. Why I say that? Because a lot of the guerrilla movements in Colombia kind of lost their popular connection with the people, and they've had to like reconcile that with these peace accords. So and that has been interrupted with because of Uribismo, because of Porky, uh Uribe's puppet. But now with Petro, Petro being even a guerrilla coming from the M19 guerrilla movement, who as well had to do a peace deal in the 90s with the Colombian government, is now more than ever able to achieve that goal of like sitting down with a guerrilla army like the ELN, El Ejército Liberación Nacional, um, and able to now have them in the fold, with the people again. So yeah, I mean, we have to be very, and also the paramilitaries too. We have to also not forget them either, because the paramilitaries are they're the dirty army of the U.S. multinational corporations that go out there and kill social leaders. Kill people like Francia Marquez. Francia Marquez, like I said, her ascension to vice president is very powerful, just because she's somebody that comes from a small village in the north part of Cauca, a historical Afro-Colombian village. She's also an environmentalist activist. She's also been somebody who's been displaced twice. So she's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, because she organized Afro-Colombian women to get a U.S. mining U.S. mining company out of her territory. So like Francia, big time, is basically the voice of the nobodies. Like she said, she's the voice of the nobodies, respectfully speaking, the people who have been marginalized. So there's a lot that there's a lot of challenges, but we have to face that with a lot of revolutionary optimism. A lot of revolutionary optimism, because these elections were a big time win, not just for Colombia, but for the whole continent. You know, you have people tuning in to these elections because they understood that if Petro and Francia win, it would be a big time shift towards the right wing and the fascists in the continent.
You're absolutely right, brother. And I think that the context that you provided is the sort of stuff that you can't really get when you're outside. And you're right, it's revolutionary optimism and also revolutionary courage, which is what Francia showed in that speech, where the laser was pointed at her. I remember seeing that video circulate, and it's just, it's insane, right? The sort of contrast. And one of the things that you mentioned, Comrade Libre, was that Colombia is one of the most, or the most dangerous places to exercise the right to vote. And you mentioned that just over the last few months with this election, there's been 40 something, I think 43, 44 people killed, activists killed. Um, so I want to, just provide a little context for how absurd the Summit of the Exclusions, passing itself as the Summit of the Americas, was. That Colombia was invited as a democracy, but the Troika, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, were excluded. And along with Colombia, you could also add Bolsonaro, who was invited and who had a one-on-one sit-down with Uncle Joe, and not the one that we like. But it's just incredible that you have this sort of society that is perhaps as undemocratic as you can get, and it's officially recognized as free and democratic by the empire. And then countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are excluded. And in the case of Venezuela, like there's not been one person from the opposition that I know of over the last 60 years killed in Cuba. And the same holds for Nicaragua and Venezuela. I mean, for fuck's sakes, Juan Guaido is still walking around, right? For us old school Marxist Leninists, that guy shouldn't be walking in that continent at all, maybe not on Earth. So how are these undemocratic societies? But then they turn around and look at Colombia, where just running a campaign is a life-risking event, and they call that democratic. But I wanted to switch the attention, since I brought up the Summit of the Americas, and perhaps you can comment a little bit before you address the next question. But one of the critiques that seems to be emerging, which isn't really a critique, but it seems to be more of a kind of a point of nuance, is about the limitations of Pedro and Marquez, because there have been statements made not too favorable to that Troika that we all inspire ourselves so much in. So we've had over the last year a couple disappointments with left-wing victories. We had Pedro Castillo, who I remember we covered very closely and we were ecstatic about, and then that didn't end up as planned. It started more excited than we were even expecting, but it kind of crashed. And then you also had Gabriel Boric, which was perhaps even more of a disappointment, because at least it seemed to be less pressure than with Castillo. But I mean, the fool literally went up to Allende's statue before he was declared president, and he like bowed in front of it. And then he turns around and not only doesn't boycott the summit, but praises Biden and condemns Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. It's just absurd. So in the context of these sort of two disappointments in Castillo in Peru and Boric in Chile, some people have wondered what are the sort of limitations that the progressiveness of the Pacto Histórico victory has, considering some of the comments previously made on Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Do you think it's going to be an anti-imperialist force in the region? I think that personally, even just existing and passing progressive things and not having beat a guy like Rodolfo Fernandez, who says that he's an admirer of Adolf Hitler, that's definitely something good. But how anti-imperialist is Pacto Histórico going to be, assuming hopefully that they're able to survive and somewhat implement the things that they have been fighting for?
Well, I think what we have to understand is Pacto Histórico is a move to the left. Given the context that left has been in favor of U.S. imperialism, has been in favor of narco dictatorships, a move to the left simply means that it's not that. Okay, so people should not make unrealistic expectations, especially considering the remarks that Petro has made in terms of critiques or observations that he has made of Troika, right? But I think realistically speaking, what we have to understand is the Pacto Histórico, and this has been said. This has been said by Francia Marquez. This has been said by Petro. Pacto Histórico is not Petro. It's not Francia Marquez. It's the people that went out to vote. It's the over 11 million Colombians that decided that there needs to be a change in Colombia. So at the end of the day, it is the task of Colombians now to hold their government that they have put into a position of power, to hold them accountable to the things that they want. And although Petro, the observation, to be clear, are they anti-imperialists? It's nuanced. I wouldn't say they're straight up anti-imperialists. I wouldn't say, like, if they were for the Troika, they probably would have been dead by now, to be honest, right? They have politics that push the country where it needs to go right now, understanding that revolution is a process. This is the first phase of Colombia to move towards a government where Colombians can stay in Colombia, and that you can create a Colombia for Colombianos, Colombianas, Colombianas, right? And so we shouldn't be disenchanted. Now, there does need to be accountability. We are going to be able to critique, because as Ymir properly observed, right, this is going to be an uphill battle, right? This is the first phase. So this is the first time in over 200 years that Colombia has elected a left government into power, and that left government is going to have to push back against 214 years of right-wing government and right-wing thinking and backwards thinking. And so we do have to be vigilant. This is also why it is the role of internationalists to support working class Colombians that have voted in favor of Pacto Histórico, to not consume the mass media that's going to be pushed out against the Petro and the Marquez government, right? Because we can expect attacks quite soon. We've already seen some of them, but we have to be a lot more principled. We have to understand that working class Colombians are not going to have a mass platform in the US. So it is going to be the role of individuals that want to be informed about what's happening in Colombia to look for alternative resources and news that is not based in the US government, or that is anti-imperialist and based in Turtle Island. And so this is our role, right? To discuss, so that people are also not feeding into the fact that some individuals think that that this government does not represent Colombians. Which Colombians? Be specific, because we need to incorporate the class analysis, and we have to understand that Pacto Histórico represents working class Colombians specifically, not the bourgeoisie, not the business owning Colombians, but the working class Colombians that took a life or death risk to exercise their right to vote for change in their country. What we also understand is that the Petro and Francia Marquez government functions within the contradictions. There are more than one military base in Colombia. That being said, Francia Marquez has made it very clear that they plan on opening relationships and recognizing Maduro as the government of Venezuela, right? And why? Well, Francia Marquez comes from Cauca, which, if you look at a map of Colombia, is the northern region of Colombia that is on the border with Venezuela, whose economy has been affected because under Uribe, they closed relations with Venezuela, closed the border, hence hindering the economic development of the region of Cauca, which happens to be Afro-Colombian, which happens to be indigenous. And so this voting for Pacto Histórico is a move towards improving the life of working class Colombians, not by definition necessarily anti-imperialist, but it does work against imperialism, and it does work in favor of working class Colombians. And it's also looking to uphold the peace accords, which folks should really look at the 2016 peace accords that took place in Cuba. Right, these are things that will affect some of the most affected people that have never in the history of Colombia had a platform to have their issues censored or addressed. And so what we can expect out of the Petro and Marquez government is that they will be pushing, hopefully, for to address the working class issues on the platform that they ran on. What we can also expect is that they exist in the contradiction of not having a majority of individuals as senators. What we can expect is that the U.S. military and the DEA are, if they haven't already, looking to intervene in what it looks like to have democracy in Colombia. And we just need to look to recent events. Comrade Yamir went to an event in New York protesting against university because they invited Duque to talk about democracy, when just last year there was a mass suppression of Colombians uprising, especially in Cali, which folks can look up the 2011 paros in Colombia, Puerto de Resistencia, where Afro-Colombians and indigenous Colombians in the port were protesting for their rights, and they were being suppressed. This was being funded by the U.S. government, no surprise. But, right, that was in the eyes of the everyone looking inside Colombia, that was a pat on the back to Duque for fighting against uprisings and anarchists and XYZ. So we have to understand where the narratives are coming from and always question, right? And in supporting the working class Colombians, we have to understand that there are going to be the contradictions, but we're going to have to be in solidarity with the working class Colombians through those contradictions and do our best to educate individuals to be in support of working class Colombians, even whether or not there is the contradiction of Petro not being able to do something that they said they were going to do, right? We don't live in an ideal world. We are scientific social. I'm scientific socialist for a reason, because I believe revolution is going to have its specific characteristics based on the country that it's in, but it's also going to have its specific contradictions, right? There are very few countries that can say they have more than 7 U.S. military bases on them. That is going to be a factor. The fact that a majority of cocaine in the world comes from Colombia is going to be a factor. But as internationalists, we have to be willing to push back against those contradictions in favor of working class Colombians, to support those working class Colombians, because unfortunately, we live in a society where, because they are fighting against imperialism, more Colombians are going to die, far less than if we were to have a Rodolfo government. But it is going to happen because imperialism is going to try to keep its claws in Colombia because it's one of the strongholds, one of the last strongholds that it has. Also, when we're talking about Petro and his critiques of Troika, and we're talking about Boric, and we're talking about Castillo, right? We have to understand that what we are observing is a shift to the left. We're not observing a shift to socialism. We're observing a shift to the left that exists in the contradictions. And a lot of the current governments have had very strong ties with the US government. So a shift to the left is literally that. Don't take it for more than what it is. It is a shift to the left. It is the role of working class people in these countries to continue to pushing left, till we can achieve socialism, till we can achieve communism. And that is going to be the same thing, the same case in Colombia, where it is going to be the revolutionary task to uphold, to push these countries further left in favor of working class people globally. And so, that being said, right, yes, Petro does exist within these contradictions, but also we have already seen him, knowing that he's going to win, shift some of his perspectives. He is willing to recognize Maduro. We have already seen how Venezuelans treat Guaido, who is the fucking president of Narnia or whatever the fuck. But right, and so so these exist, right? Francia Marquez is going to be pushing to open up relations with Venezuela. What does that also mean? That means that 6 million Colombians that are currently in Venezuela in the next elections are going to have access to vote. That's a powerful thing, something that did not exist in this election, something that could have allowed for a first-time victory for Petro and Francia Marquez, so that there wouldn't have to be a second round, right? So there are 6 million Colombians waiting to participate in their own country's elections, in their own country's rebuilding of a new Colombia. And so there is a lot to look forward to. It will not be without critiques, but we have to be principled enough to support this working class movement, understanding that there are figureheads that are going to be leading this movement, but that ultimately the working class Colombians are going to continue to fight for this thing called democracy that does not exist in the US, in Turtle Island, right? That they are trying to form in their new country, in this Nuevo Colombia that they are creating.
Beautifully said, brother. One of the things we often emphasize is that revolution is a process. If you keep that in mind, you realize you're not expected, you can't judge things according to what the books say the end is supposed to look like. And because it's a process is why you have to realize, as you said perfectly, that there's different starting points and different concrete conditions for how that process is going to look, right? In some places, the beginning of that process is already a little bit ahead. In other places like Colombia, when you've had 200 straight years of the far right ruling and of capital's absolute dominance over labor and working people, obviously the beginning of the process is going to look like it's a bit backwards in terms of in relation to some other countries that were able to directly start off with an anti-imperialist government. So I think perfectly said. Yamir, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean to add, I guess like what Brother Libre was saying, Comrade Libre was saying, this win right here is historic. Just just for the fact that it's a big time pushback from U.S. imperialism. It's a big time pushback from U.S. dominance, and it shows how the U.S. is losing its grip in the continent. I mean, with a country like Colombia that has so much invested militarily wise, and how Colombia is a strategic point for the U.S. to attack Venezuela. Like there's been a lot of these operations, whether it was Operation Gideon, where they called the Bay of Piglets, where you had like these mercenaries that were trained by, I forgot the brother's name, but it was like these veterans from Afghanistan, that they tried to I don't know, they had like a movie in their minds. They thought about Rambo or something like that, because they were trying to wing it like on some Rambo shit. And they went in and they got neutralized by Afro-Venezuelan fishermen that were part of the militia, la Miliciano Bolivariana. And but all of that was launched from Colombia. It was launched from the Colombian territory. And there's been multiple attacks, I mean, from paramilitary forces to try to get into Venezuela. And also the concert that they had, the SOS Venezuela concert, where they tried to like sneak in weapons under the gist of humanitarian aid. So it's gonna be very interesting that now Colombia is gonna reestablish relations with Venezuela. Gustavo Petro, even though he's had his comments and his critiques about Venezuela and Nicaragua, he's been very careful with Cuba. I feel like with Cuba, he's he's respectful because of the peace accords. Like he's also, the thing too is that like what people have to understand is that Colombia is very anti-communist. Like that there's a sphere of anti-communism that's very entrenched due to the oligarchy and U.S. intervention and propaganda. I could also go into how Colombia's also been a base not just militarily but also think tanks, you know, against like anti-communism, anti-socialist movements in the region. I mean, if you know we're gonna soon talk about Ecuador. I mean, Guillermo Lazo's campaign, if it wasn't for Alvaro Uribe helping him out with the propaganda tools of, you know, these terms like Castro Chavismo, um, Guillermo Lazo wouldn't have gotten far in Ecuador. But like Petro, you know, he has to be very careful, and he's smart. You know, he knows that they're gonna Venezuelan bait him. They're gonna like try everything to like try to compare him to Maduro, or try to say that he's going to turn Colombia into Venezuela. And what they mean by that, what they try to express by that, is that Venezuela is a failed state. You know, when, you know, Colombia is worse than Venezuela. You know, Colombia has inequality, there's massive unemployment, massive violence, social leaders getting killed. It's not to say that Venezuela doesn't have problems. I mean, Venezuela, it has economic problems, but that's due to sanctions. That's due to illegal unilateral coercive measures brought by the economic war of the U.S., which has caused Venezuela massive inflation, and has a sector of its population migrate to Colombia and other South American nations. But some of them migrate back because they really don't see like any future in like countries where, you know, there's not even future for the people there, for the natives there either. So yeah, I mean, Petro, there was a debate he had that I found interesting. There was a question in the debate that was given to him that he said, "Oh, you know, is Maduro gonna come to your inauguration?" And he was like, "No." But the way he answered it was very intelligently, because he said there's no relations between Colombia and Venezuela. You know, I mean, he didn't have to he didn't have to bring out the elephant in the room, how Porky recognizes this, you know, fake dweeb of Juan Guaido. But yeah, no, Petro said that once relationships are reestablished, then we could talk about Maduro coming to the inauguration. But I do feel though that let me see. I have a picture that I feel like is a picture that I actually was like the first one to put it up. It's now circulating. It's right here with Petro and Chavez.
We shared it. We shared it yesterday.
Yeah.
It's on our Instagram, I believe.
I think that was in 1994, and that's after Hugo Chavez got out of prison, and they it was like an event in Colombia. It was at in un foro de Simón Bolívar, but it was in this institution called Simón Rodriguez. That was Simón Bolívar's teacher. A big important thinker also in Latin America. But so I do feel that I have a belief that like Petro has Bolivarianism. A lot of people say that he's not part of the Bolivarian momentum. Part of me disagrees with that, just because I feel like, you know, he comes from a movement, M19, a guerrilla movement, which, you know, a lot of it was like a mixture of like national patriotism and democratic socialism. Um, and they would do stuff symbolically, like try to rob the sword of Bolivar for the people. Or I think they like occupied the Dominican Republic consulate. But and also is also to say, like, they say, you know, when Petro was the mayor of Bogota, he put up in his office a portrait of Simon Bolivar, which after his tenure, when he left um his office, the portrait was put down, and then they put up like the guy who historically betrayed Simon Bolivar, Francisco Paul de Santander. Um, So like there's a sentiment of Bolivarianism with Petro. You know, like Petro in his speech, he talked about sitting down with the United States and having the United States recognize our diversity as Latin Americans, as like we need to coexist in this hemisphere. Um, there's this sense, but it's very passive. I'm not trying to say that Petro's like Hugo Chavez in any sense, but um, like I said, everything has to start somewhere. You know, like there can be massive critiques. I could easily talk about how Hugo Chavez, when he first became the president of Venezuela, he didn't claim himself as a socialist. He started claiming socialism when in 2005. 21st century socialism. When he first got into power, he spoke about this third way between capitalism and socialism, but talked about how he was a fan of the Cuban Revolution. But after he got cooled by the oligarchy, he saw that he had to, just shift his mind into supporting more socialism and opening himself up more as a socialist. Um, so, like, yeah, I do, and I also, this also came to mind too. Even if people think that Petro might have his doubts of the Troika, best believe the Troika is supporting Petro. You know, the Troika is, because Twitter, for example, you had Diaz-Canel that said congratulations to Petro in Francia, Maduro that said congratulations to Petro in Francia, and Daniel Ortega too. There was a tweet from Nicaragua as well. So there's like we also have to be kind of like understanding like things have to start somewhere. Like Libre said it like very well, very eloquently. It's not like a shift to like an anti-imperialist movement. This is a shift to the left, but like historically, like Colombia, this is powerful just because now they're gonna be able to have a chance to have a popular government, and hopefully Petro and Francia are able to sow the seeds, of anti-imperialism within the Colombian youth, within Colombian society. Um, so we have to be positive. We have to be optimistic. I mean, the best thing here though is that Venezuela doesn't have that much of an aggressor like before, like with Duque. And then this is gonna help Venezuela with the sanctions as well, having these relations. So yeah.
Yeah, we published an article actually about how they were celebrating the victory of Petro in Venezuela, which goes to what you were saying there, that the Troika is definitely celebrating this victory, even if they can't be openly anti-imperialist. And we had some people asking for sources to kind of break through the imperialist U.S. media bullshit in the chat, and people were sharing some good ones. So if y'all have any that I miss, you can let me know. But this is one that Comrade Libre shared. What is this called, Comrade? Sorry, my Spanish is a work in progress.
Infobay. I think it's like Spanglish, but it's a resource that dives into like statistics. So like, how did people vote? Who voted for Petro? Who voted for Rodolfo? Who voted en blanco, which means they decided not to vote for anybody, and then null votes. Which a lot of those null votes, to be specific, were from the consulates outside of the U.S. or outside of Colombia. Because as somebody that went to Colombia to observe, and then someone that in La Segunda Vuelta, the second round, I went to observe here in Miami. Here in Miami, like they got caught trying to do a lot of fraud. People were voting 2 times for Rodolfo. People's voting ledgers were already marked, which would make it null. But if you're not paying attention, you wouldn't observe that. So there have been a lot of attempts to discredit and move. But this is a good resource that really breaks down statistically who voted in favor, who didn't, and gives a decent analysis. I hope they have an option to make it into English, but numbers are universal, so you can look at numbers. There's also indepas.org that CO. And there's also the Center for Hemispheric Affairs. There's a few really good articles, as well as the Alliance for Global Justice has released some really good content. And Black Alliance for Peace. Our comrades at Black Alliance for Peace are always doing some really good internationalist work. They were also observing elections in Cali, Colombia. And Red Condor is the last one that I will add. Red Condor Collective.
Forget about Troika.
I have Troika pulled up here. It's one of the ones I was going to show.
I was gonna say, you said, did you mention Multipolarista?
Oh, that's a good one.
That's a good one, Multipolarista. We were actually on Multipolarista with Ben Norton. I mean, talking about the first round of the elections. And I think Orinoco Tribune, you mentioned them. They're good. And Venezuelan Analysis as well. I think they and also for people, I mean, that's read in Spanish, Misión Verdad is also another good source.
Absolutely. I think I have a couple of those pulled up that you guys mentioned, but a lot of unique ones that even some of the ones you mentioned I didn't know about. So I'm looking forward to checking those out. But here's the ones I just thought of off the top of my head. Here's obviously Troika Collective, their Instagram page. Obviously, these guys are always sharing great stuff. And then here's the Midwestern Marx archives on Colombia. We publish a lot of it. For those who don't know, we do have a website where we publish news and articles, and that's how our project started. Although we do all this streaming and stuff, so we'll republish stuff like one of our comrades mentioned the Orinoco Tribune. So here's something we republished from them about how Colombia trains and sends mercenaries around the world to help imperialism. Someone in the chat mentioned Mint Press News. They're really good. Here's something they did about a U.S. fugitive who was armed by the Colombian government and sent to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Kind of a story that goes along with what we were saying about how Colombia is used as sort of a foothold for the empire in Latin America and used as a way to attack Venezuela. I don't know how do you pronounce this?
Adolfo.
That's
Casuacha News.
That one's from after the coup.
Causechan, yeah. That's the comrades in Bolivia. They always do amazing work.
That's the comrade Camila Escalante and Ali Vargas.
Yes, Camila and Ali Vargas are also great people to follow on Twitter for news and info about Latin America. Venezuela Analysis that you guys mentioned, this is my go-to for Venezuela, and it was when I was writing my senior thesis there on Venezuela. So they publish a lot on Colombia because obviously what happens in Colombia has great effects or great interest for the people of Venezuela, the working people of Venezuela. So here you can kind of get news on Colombia from a Venezuelan perspective. Here's People's Dispatch. This is another one of my favorites. Comrade Libre was talking about how, the need to make a class analysis and, not just support these left-wing or socialist leaders who take power, but the working class movements and grassroots movements behind them. And I think that's something that we fail to do sometimes on the Western left. Like, we live in this liberal hegemony. It's easy to fall into the sort of liberal great man of history fallacy, where we're just, looking at a country based on who the leader is. And then anytime something happens in that country, we're like, oh, this leader is either good or bad. I either support this or don't support this. But obviously it's more complex than that. There's a lot of different factors and different contradictions in each country. And then Telesur. This is Venezuelan state media. So they publish good stuff about Colombia as well. So yeah. Anyone else got something they want to add here?
No, that trio of Multipolarista, Orinoco, and Venezuela Analysis, we republish a lot from them. I just wanted to emphasize, perhaps, as my specific closing for the topic of Colombia, I'd like to hopefully get on the topic of Ecuador if you comrades have time. But I mentioned the anti-imperialism thing because of the reactions that we getting on social media to this victory. And one of the things that leaves out, or the emphasis is more so symbolic on what has been said. But if you analyze the policies that Pedro and Marquez are putting forward with Pacto Histórico, by dealing with national affairs, they're also crumbling what is one of the strongholds for U.S. imperialism in the region. So they're being maybe not directly symbolic, but as a latent effect of fixing the country and democratizing it, they're also actively doing anti-imperialism. Because as you mentioned, Ymir, some of the main operations in the last 2 years or in 2022, in the last 3-4 years of U.S. operations against Venezuela, they've came out of Colombia. So if they're able to limit that as part of the process of moving away from death squads and the violence that takes place in the streets, if they limit that, they're also creating conditions for Latin America to flourish and to not have these constant training of these death squads in Colombia to do the dirty job of imperialism in the region.
I was gonna add really quickly. My bad. I just gonna because I had a chance to meet Francia Marquez when she came to New York City a couple of months ago. This is when she was running for the presidency. And I'll tell you this: she's very well aware of how like these paramilitaries get the same training as like say the police here in the United States. Like she connected the dots very well. She understood about how the oppression of like black and brown people from the police state here is intertwined with like the paramilitary forces that oppress black and indigenous Colombians in Colombia. That's all I just had to say.
And Comrade Lieber, did you have a comment?
Yeah. The comment that I was gonna make on this is we have to stop being so dogmatic. We have to understand. First of all, we live in a country where we have not consolidated power in favor of working class people. So, people in Turtle Island, let's observe that there is a leftist victory in Colombia. Second of all, what we also have to observe is we cannot bring our pessimism of recent other elections into the conversation of Colombia and try to compare them so subjectively, right? Again, revolution is going to be specific to the conditions of said country. So what is happening in Peru, what is happening in Chile, what is happening in Honduras, and what is happening in Colombia are all different. They are moves to the left, but the extent of that left movement is specific to that country, right? And so in Colombia, they just elected a leftist government that we must support as well as critique, and that we have a duty to connect with the working class folks of these countries to help them continue to uphold the thing that they have been fighting for, that they finally been able to achieve. And you can find some of these organizations or find connections to some of the work that's already being done through some of the organizations, right? Like Troika, like Red Condor Collective, that are helping to build connections with our comrades over there to not say how we should support Colombians, but rather to hear what Colombians are asking of us to do for them as they continue to fight and live in the reality that they are trying in the Colombia that they're trying to construct, this new Colombia. And so let's also let's observe what is happening in Colombia. Let's support what is happening in Colombia, and let's not try to compare it to other places until we can see tangibly what is or is not being done. But also understanding that we are supporting movements, we are not supporting people, because it is the masses of the people that carry on a movement. And essentially, the people that got elected into office this past weekend were the working class Colombian people, were the Afro-Colombians, were the indigenous Colombians, were the women, were the individuals that have made sacrifices like Unión Patriótica, like Partido Comunista, that have been attacked historically, right? This is a victory for the people of Colombia, right? We just have names for these people, right? But Petro and Francia represent the masses of Colombians. So let's be very clear that the fight that they're taking politically is one that has been fought with blood, sweat, and tears tangibly over the last 214 years. And that is itself a huge victory for the people of Colombia.
Beautifully said, brother. Do we want to give any last final comments on Colombia before we roll into the topic of Ecuador? I think we could probably treat that as its own topic. Eddie, what do you think?
Yeah. I think we should. I mean, this has been super informative, but we've been going for about an hour and a half on Colombia now, so we should probably switch gears. If the comrades have time and want to share their knowledge on Colombia, we'd love to hear it. I mean, sorry, on Ecuador. The last thing I wanted to add is I see people in the chat saying they're optimistic watching this podcast, this stream. I think there's reason to be optimistic, at least if you take a global perspective. I mean, the U.S. empire and capitalist imperial hegemony is fading. The imperialism, which is the highest stage of capitalism, is starting to weaken. And there's an anti-imperialist alliance being formed against the U.S. And it is inspiring because, like, you were saying something earlier. I can't remember which one of you was saying it. But you're saying that Uribismo was basically trying to drive a stake or a knife into the heart of the Colombian people. And it's like the U.S. empire for years has done everything they can to kill the revolutionary spirit of the people all across Latin America. We were sharing this infographic earlier of Operation Condor. I mean, the U.S. was funding and arming paramilitaries, putting in U.S.-backed puppet dictators like the Pinochet dictatorship, who were massacring people in the National Soccer Stadium. And the CIA were giving kill lists to their preferred leaders in Latin America, just with names of leftists. Anybody, communist, socialist, any kind of left-wing ideology, they could be killed and hunted down by the puppets of the U.S. empire. So, and the CIA was training these dictators up in the torture techniques that they developed in MK Ultra. So it's like everything that the U.S. empire has, or everything that they could have tried to do to wipe the revolutionary spirit out of Latin America, they've tried to do, and it hasn't worked. We've seen this, the pink wave, and now is sort of like what we call a second pink wave, where all these leftists, if they're not, fully socialist or Marxist leaders, coming to power. And that's symbolic, but Colombia especially, because it's for so long been a stronghold of the empire. The fact that there's any kind of left-wing movement in Colombia, despite the fact that they're literally, risking their lives, risking being killed by the imperialists, like, it shows that the power is still with the masses. And the idea that the struggle for socialism is over and we reached an end of history when the USSR fell is ridiculous. And I think anyone who still believes that needs to take a look at Latin America.
It's there's a sort of metaphor that Fidel gives Salvador Allende in 1971 in their encounter. He says that Latin America has a baby in its womb, and that baby is revolution. And whether it's born on a shanty town or whether it's born in a fancy hospital, it will be born. And I think that's what we've been seeing over the last couple of years. But any closing remarks on Colombia before we shift gears into Ecuador?
Libra, you want to go first, or?
I got you. I just want to say again, let's remember to be in solidarity, like in practice, and to do our research and to dismantle the lies that will be told And these are things we can prepare for. We can expect that anytime that anything that does not support imperialism, that there will be attacks. And so please look at the resources that we have shared, and continue to do research. Understand that we do not live and in Colombia, that this is not a move towards idealism. This is a move towards this process called revolutionary, and this is simply the first step. And so in this first phase, and a historic move towards the left, like, let's be in solidarity with Colombia despite the contradictions, and also attempt to do our due diligence for the people of Colombia and organize and overthrow imperialism, because that is our role here where we find ourselves in Turtle Island. Our revolutionary task is to not only support the revolutions that do exist, the revolutions that are happening, but also to fight for revolution here on Turtle Island. And also free Puerto Rico, and shout out to Colombia, because this brings us closer to our liberation for independence from the US government.
Independencia para Puerto Rico. All right. Yeah, I was actually at fun fact, yesterday I was actually at a committee, the decolonization committee in the UN for Puerto Rico, which was started by Cuba, and it turned 50 years yesterday. So I remember talking about that, what happened in Colombia, like the example that we gave, as a people, fighting, to achieve our first popular government in these electoral ballots, was an example that we were giving to the whole continent, that things are possible, and that a free Puerto Rico is possible, a free Palestine is possible, and also a Cuba without a blockade is possible as well. So now I'm trying to really be very concise, because I'm Colombian, and this is like a very emotional moment for me, because something I didn't share is also, like, I have family that were also part of the guerrillas as well, like my father and my uncle, who also voted for Petro. I had my father at he was locked up with Petro's comrades in M19, so, and was forced to be exiled out of Colombia for like 20 years. I mean, he had to flee out and everything. But this win right here is like, it means a lot for my father, and it was on Father's Day too. It was a great gift. And also something also cool to note, like when I think about it, is just the way how Petro's movement M19 was born on the 19th. His birthday's on the 19th, and they were victorious on the 19th. June 19th. So that's a very powerful number. But yeah, anyways, Gustavo Petro being our new first leftist president, ex-guerrilla too, and as well as Francia Marquez, that she's an Afro-Colombian woman. And the reason why I keep emphasizing that is the fact that Colombia, we're like Brazil as well. We are an African nation, like, we are the third country outside of the African diaspora to have a high population of Afro descendants. After Brazil, after the U.S. and Haiti's right after us. And also, it's just, I also got to share this too, because this is very emotional for me too. I had a brother from Haiti that I met in Venezuela last year, that he's in France right now, that called me the day after the elections, and he was like, yo, that this means a lot for us in Haiti as well. Like, I want you to know that. And I was like, I understood, because of Francia, because of Francia Marquez being a black woman, and she's just very, very black, and I love it. You know what I mean? Because it shows the diversity of our people that never get a voice, and she knows that as well. She knows that she represents that diversity, not for the Afro-Colombian community, but also for the indigenous and for the other marginalized. She said this in her speech. She says she thanks the indigenous, the Afro, the women, the LGBTQ, the farmers, all the different sectors, the youth as well. How Petro said how he's planning to as well free the youth that are locked up right now because of last year's national strike. And also how it was also powerful too, how he had the mother of a woman that lost her son, Dylan Cruz, in right there, right in the speech. So this really brought like it felt very grassroots. It felt very organic, and this is the whole main part of this too. Like Francia, for example, she's not a traditional politician. Like when Trump talks about I'm not a traditional politician, France is not really a traditional politician. She's never taken a political seat. She comes from the grassroots, literally, as a black woman organizer against mining, against for the environment. Um, so this right here is very powerful. Like I said, once again, this is a victory not just for the Colombian people, but for also La Patria Grande, for Latin America, because everybody was watching that, whether it was people from Cuba, the president from Cuba, the president from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Honduras, the ex-president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, Evo Morales. So we've made history, and when I say we, not just Colombia, but us Latin Americans too, that we're getting closer to that unification, because when one of us win, we all win. And that's how I felt yesterday, and that's how I know that things are possible. Like I said, one again, a free Puerto Rico is possible, a Cuba without a blockade is possible, a free Palestine is possible, and a socialist revolution one day in the Turtle Island is also possible. We just gotta believe. We gotta figure out how we unify as a people. But yes, I'm very like I said, I'm full of jubilious. I'm very celebratory right now. I'm gonna be like this for like a whole week. I can't wait to party more with my people this coming weekend, and I can't wait to go. I'm gonna plan to go to Colombia this August 7th to see that inauguration, that historic inauguration, of our ex-guerrilla first leftist president Gustavo Petro, and our first female Afro vice president queen Francia Marquez.
Hell yeah. I don't know if anyone could put it in a better way.